And now to our interview segment. My guest, Professor Fidelis Oditah, is a Queen's Counsel in England, a senior advocate of Nigeria, a bencher of Lincoln's Inn, and a visiting professor at the University of Oxford. His law practice encompasses energy, projects, companies, and general commercial law. In this interview, we talk about law, oil and power issues, and of course, what can be done better. A lot of people have described the immediate past administration in different ways, but I want to hear your assessment, your view of how well the immediate past administration did, especially when you think of what the primary responsibility of government should be to the people.
I think President Jonathan probably did his best, but his best wasn't good enough. I also believe that he may have been deceived by the sycophants that he surrounded himself with into thinking that he was a high-achieving president. But as far as the ordinary people on the street were concerned, there was little to show for his 5 years of administration. Of course, when criticism is made of his administration, he often takes refuge in a few spurious achievements, one of which is the privatization of PHCN, the old NEPA. But anyone who has lived in Nigeria in the last 6 months, particularly in the last 2 months, must conclude that there is no power supply. In Lagos, for example, in April, I do not think, whether in the office or at home, that we had up to 20 hours of a supply of electricity. I was a little surprised to receive a bill of 50-something thousand for April, which meant that I was paying about 2,500 naira for each hour of electricity. I find that extremely difficult to count as an achievement of Jonathan. Secondly, it appears that the so-called privatization has been done largely to benefit his friends. Electricity is a high-impact infrastructure. It's a capital-intensive infrastructure. But there is no evidence, as far as we can see, that the people who bought the assets of PHCN have the financial capacity to support the acquisition. A number of them took bank loans, which they have been unable to service, let alone have money to invest in these businesses. Nigerian masses benefit very little from the government. One would have been tempted to say that if subsidy is what they benefit from, it should stay, so that there is at least some element of government presence in their lives. Sadly, our experience over the past few years, especially during the tenure of President Jonathan, has shown that it is actually Nigerians subsidizing a few elites. Well, let me not even dignify them by calling them elite. It's the ordinary Nigerians subsidizing a few crooks and thieves who have profited excessively and fraudulently from the petroleum subsidy. So it is not a case of the ordinary people benefiting from it. I don't know how much you benefit, how much you bought petrol or diesel or kerosene recently, but a lot of people have made a lot of money, not through a dint of hard work, but just through fraudulent means. And I do not think that any system can sustain that level of fraud in the name of subsidy. So my position is that Nigeria will benefit more by abolition of subsidy than by its retention.
What about agriculture? Surely there's been some success in that area.
There was some success in agriculture. And for the first time, according to them, the distribution of fertilizers appears to have gone well. The effort to encourage domestic cultivation of rice appears to have enjoyed a measure of success, which appears to have emerged in the last few months by the waiver scam that affected importation of rice. As I understand, that policy was intended to give waivers to rice farmers to import specified quantities of rice. But the number of people, incorporated companies, and call them farms, submitted to the Ministry of Agriculture and got waivers. But in any event, even without the fraud which characterized certain aspects of that policy, like many aspects of the policies implemented during the tenure of President Jonathan, there must be some question mark as to the wisdom of encouraging domestic production of rice on one hand, and then giving waivers to import large quantities of rice on the other hand. I understand that initially it was intended to supplement domestic production, which was insufficient to cover the local demand. But like most policies of President Jonathan, even those that were well-intentioned, that too was hijacked by cabal and who profited excessively from it.
So what should the new government do?
We want the government to focus on those areas that government is best at. Education, health, road, those foundational infrastructure that the government is best at. And then extricate the government from areas of commerce where you must encourage private enterprise. And so I'm not myself in favor of a government going back into petroleum. I don't see why we should privatize PHCM, for example, and then the government makes fresh investments in the refining of crude. They must open up the sector to public sector investment.
Let us talk specifically now about the administration of justice, the Ministry of Justice, the police, the courts, and the prisons. What reforms do you think that the new government should put in place to get the kind of system that Nigerians want?
I think the civil and criminal justice administration in Nigeria is near collapse. If we take the civil justice system as an example, I've often said that the problem in Nigeria is not access to justice, it's exit from justice. You file a claim, it takes several years to get resolved. In the Supreme Court today, appeals from 2005 are being heard 10 years after. The Supreme Court has prioritized, for good or bad, constitutional appeals and election matters. So if you have those matters, you could get them heard rapidly. But those cases, high profile though they are very insignificant in terms of a proportion of civil litigation. The ordinary civil litigation is plagued by avoidable delays, misuse of interlocutory processes, and the unwillingness of the courts to exercise sufficient case management powers to ensure that the cases are resolved rapidly. There is also a wholesale failure by the courts to provide the litigants with economic incentives to litigate responsibly. The courts represent a scarce resource which must be used judiciously and efficiently. You cannot operate a system where anyone can file a case, however frivolous, file any number of interlocutory applications, waste everyone's time, occupy the court space and time for years on end.
So where do we place the blame?
At the end of which you award 10,000 or 2,000 naira cost. The object of cost, any system that awards costs in litigation, the object is to indemnify either partially or fully the successful party for the cost he or she has incurred in actually bringing or prosecuting or defending the proceedings. I do not see how you could have a system where in the Supreme Court, for example, for a case that has taken 15 or 20 years to resolve from first instance through the Court of Appeal to the Supreme Court, that court awards 100,000 naira as the cost of the proceedings which took 20 years. And you ask yourself, where do those justices live? In dreamland, in Mickey Mouse Kingdom, or in the real world? What is 100,000 supposed to signify? Is that the cost of the airfare for that final day that they pronounce the result? Or is it the cost of the hotel bills? Is it the cost of the lawyers? Is it the cost to the litigants? What exactly is that? 10 years ago, I conducted research to see how Nigeria has lost its way in the area of cost. And I discovered that in the 70s and 80s, the judges were awarding, in some cases, 400,000 naira. At that time, 400,000 naira was about $400,000 at least, or 400,000 pounds. Now, if you benchmark that to today, 400,000 pounds would probably give you about 120, 130 million naira. I'm not saying that every case has to attract that level of cost, but unless you can impose meaningful costs, you cannot encourage people to use the court processes reasonably and efficiently. And also the courts must exercise the jurisdiction to impose wasted costs on counsel themselves, the lawyers, because a lot of the delay is caused by the lawyers. People turning up, people refusing to turn up, sending letters on the day of a hearing, judges failing to sit and telling the clerk to adjourn the cases to 10 months or 9 months or whatever. There is just too much indiscipline, and no system can work like that. So you've got to impose some discipline, you've got to impose some incentives like award of costs, and then you have to introduce greater use of technology in those courts. The Nigerian Bar Association is trying to tackle this. It set up a rules and practice committee, which incidentally I'm chairing, to see how we might be able to reform some of this. But of course, above all, you've got to change the attitude of the principal stakeholders, especially the judges, and to get them to perform their functions properly.
That is our interview and the program this week. What are your thoughts? Please share them via email, Facebook, or Twitter. I am Shola Shoyeli. Thank you for watching.